Hello friends, Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. We're going to be talking about something, I'm getting back to some more of these conceptual or concept videos. They are, more difficult to do, and honestly I get a little bit, lazy. But I think this one's important. I think this is a thing that people not only mess up a lot, but it's a thing I feel like I can maybe shine some light on for people. Not that I've got the entire concept on lockdown, but I think that I can point you in the right direction of things to think about when it comes to sizing your bets correctly. So there's really four basic or fundamental guiding principles, I feel, when it comes to sizing your bets. The first one is, and these are in no particular order, your betting range. So like the hands that you're going to bet or, raise or just get aggressive with in any particular situation, the overall range of hands that you're going to use in that spot to get aggressive with should guide your betting size, your bet sizing. Again, in no particular order. Targeting. So the range of hands that you're betting against, whether you're making a value bet and you're targeting, weaker, you're targeting parts of your opponent's range that are weaker than the hand that you're betting. You kind of have to know something about your opponent's range and what types of hands he's likely to call with or fold. And this can be if you're value betting, bluffing, semi-bluffing, whatever the case is. Knowing your opponent's range and what hands you're targeting also helps guide your bet sizing, or ought to. If your opponent has a pretty weak range, then not only can you save yourself money on the bluffs that don't work by sizing your bluffs smaller, but you can also try to eke out a little extra value by sizing your value bets smaller when your opponent seems to have mostly weakish hands in their range. Stack to pot ratio, obviously really important, and especially in situations where you're trying to get stacks in, or you're trying to not get stacked. Knowing the stack to pot ratio is pretty important in a lot of situations when it comes to sizing your bets. You flop the set and you want to try to get stacks in by the river. You kind of have to know something about the size of the pot in relation to the stack sizes that are behind in order to know how to to size your bets with maximum efficiency. And last but not least, we need to know something about our opponent. What's he? How is he likely to interpret various sizings that we use? Is he going to be extremely elastic or inelastic? Is he going to make hero calls against what appears to be a polarized bet range and sizing? And is he maybe the type of guy that is going to spaz out and just shove against a small, weak-looking bet? So knowing things about villain, also very important. So one thing we definitely need to know before we can size our bets is, should we be betting? And if, in order to know whether we should be betting at all, we need to know what we're hoping to accomplish or trying to accomplish with the bet. And I did a video specifically on reasons to bet, and if you're kind of torn or you're not sure what camp is correct in terms of how many reasons there really are to bet, because there's a lot of discrepancies. I don't feel like there's a real consensus on this out there, but I feel like I've got this I've got this nailed down pretty well. I think there's really just two reasons to bet. The first reason is going to be to get more money in a pot when you're a favorite to win that pot, and that often is and usually means value betting, but not always. I mean, you could actually be in a spot where you have a very profitable double barrel, and you bet the flop planning on barreling the turn, but you actually kind of hope that you get called on the flop, because if you do get called on the flop, you feel like you're going to win more than your fair share of the money that goes in on the flop by continuing to bluff. So getting more money in a pot when you're a favorite to win at or before showdown. And the other reason is to fold your opponent's equity out. So you can think of this as bluffing, but also this one thing, fold your opponent's equity share, can apply it to bluffing, and that's when you're actually hoping they fold a better hand than what you're betting. But sometimes people call it protection, and sometimes they just call it denying their opponent's equity share. But you're just in a spot where if you can get immediate folds right here and right now, it's going to be better than if you checked, or better if you get called. Then you can try to size your bets in accordance with the idea, and the idea of this specific bet might be to hopefully get a fold from your opponent on this street, right here at this decision point. And I think those two reasons are all there are. I think it's sufficient. I think it conveys information and gives you a way to think about it without being too complex. And it removes a lot of the excess baggage that can come from thinking about things like betting for value or betting as a bluff, but sometimes using protection bets and probe bets and blocking bets and all of that. I don't think all those things are real, and to the degree that they're real, they're overcomplications, and to the degree that they're simplifying anything, they're not real. And then getting back to just sizing, and the first thing we talked about, our aggression range, and what its effect is going to be on proper bet sizing. Basically, in a nutshell, the more polarized your betting range is going to be, the bigger you ought to bet. Now, if you're on the river, this is pretty strictly true. And when you're on an earlier street, it's true, but needs to be weighed in with other factors, right? But from a GTO perspective, when you get to the river and you're in a pure polar versus bluff catcher situation, you ought to be betting all in, with your entire aggressive range. And that holds for any stack size that you're likely to play. I mean, this can definitely be the case if you even have 3 times the size of the pot behind. Then you can move in with a polarized range, and using the bigger sizing actually, and this is the point down here, using a larger sizing actually allows you to bluff more often. It allows you to put more bluffs in your range without playing an exploitable strategy, because of the indifference principle. And the indifference principle is it's a game theory concept, and basically it's the idea that your bet sizing should make your opponent indifferent between calling or folding the bluff catchers in his range, allowing you to break even with your bluffs and make money with the value part of your range. And the opposite then, so if we know that when we're in a polarized versus bluff catcher scenario, we should be betting very big with our nutted value hands and some number of bluffs equal to the ratio that is required to keep our opponent breaking even or indifferent on their bluff catchers. The opposite is also true, that the more hands you want to be aggressive with, so the more merged or linear or depolarized your betting range is going to be, the smaller your bet sizing should tend to be. So if you get to a flop where you're just going to be making a range bet with your entire range, you normally want to keep those bets pretty small. Like if your pre-flop raiser from under the gun in a full ring game, and you get called by the big blind and the flop comes out like ace-9-2 rainbow, and you feel like it probably makes the most sense to just bet every hand you have, then you want to use small bets. Again, these effects can be tempered by the other things we have looked at and are going to discuss in a little more depth, but generally speaking, that's the case. But the stack to pot ratio, you could say that we want to make big bets with polarized ranges, and we want to make small bets with a merged range. But what is a big bet and what is a small bet? And that really boils down to the SPR. That's the ratio between the stack and the pot. So whatever the effective stack is, like whoever's got the smaller stack, like if you're in a heads-up, you're playing a heads-up pot, and your opponent has 100 big blinds, and you've got 150, the effective stack is 100, If the pot's 20, then you have an SPR of 5 or 5 to 1. That's your stack to pot ratio. And understanding the stack to pot ratio and kind of understanding how pots grow geometrically, the pot geometry, will help you to get stacks in when you want to, avoid it when you don't, and really give you an idea of what it means to bet big or what it means to bet small. It's the size of the pot that determines what size bet will be offering what price, and that's really what a lot of this comes down to, is if you're playing in a 20 chip pot, a 10 chip bet is offering your opponent 3 to 1 on a call. And so in order to keep them indifferent between calling or folding with their bluff catchers, that matters. If you're and also if you are bluffing, the size of the stacks and the size of the pot, if you're going to go all in on the river with a bluff, then it also matters, because that's the price that you're laying yourself. So the size of the stacks behind determine the immediate pot odds, and they also determine implied odds, and obviously then the reverse of that, reverse implied odds. The other thing is we need to, one of the main things that we can factor in, and this is especially true when we're going to use an exploitative bet size, and we're kind of not really so worried about having a balanced range, or using choosing a bet sizing and a betting range that's going to be well balanced and close to equilibrium. But when we have an idea of how our opponent is going to respond to certain bet sizings, if we know he's super elastic, and usually you ought to be elastic, and that just means that the bigger we bet, the less often he's going to continue, well, then we're going to use one size bet. But if our opponent is going to be inelastic and he's just either going to call or not with most of his range, then we can size our bluffs smaller, and we can size our value bets larger. And it could even be the case that due to whatever history you have with your opponent, and what he's seen you show down, and the lines he has seen you take, and just whatever metagame dynamics are in play, it could be the case that your opponent will actually be reverse elastic, or he'll have anti-elasticity, making him in a given spot more likely to call a large bet than a small bet. This can be the case even against a fairly decent player if we have taken a line that makes our hand or our betting range appear to be polarized, but we're actually range merging. We're betting for thinner value than what it would look like we're betting for, because we've really got just a dead read on villain, and we really understand his range and how he plays it. Then sometimes we can use a bigger bet size and sort of feign a polarized range, and that could induce more hero calls, because your opponent just kind of feels like you're so polarized that maybe second pair with no kicker is equivalent in his mind to top pair top kicker against the range he expects you to bet. If you bet big enough that your range appears to be polarized, then you may actually get more calls using that sizing than using a smaller size that keeps more of your value range intact and gives your opponent a harder decision. So if you can find spots where your opponent is likely to be inelastic, you can really print money, make some very profitable bluffs and very profitable calls. Bets, value bets. And also, even more so, if you can find spots where your opponent is going to be anti-elastic, then you can really make some profitable, especially value bets, like bigger value bets than you ought to be able to get away with. But you do need to know something about villain in order to even think about trying to pull something like that off. It's also wise to try to take into consideration what you think your opponent's emotional state is. And I think this is especially true. I've noticed this a lot playing live. I've been playing a lot more live $2, $5 no-limit hold'em ring games, cash games. But I think this is very important. If you have an idea of whether your opponent is on tilt, or if he's getting frustrated, and sometimes you just kind of feel like your opponent's just about on the verge of breaking, and if you were to run one more bluff, he's just going to go nuts, and you have a value hand. And maybe you could find a spot where if you use like a tiny little bet when it looks like he's got no hands that can call you, that you can use like a 1/3 size of the pot bet and get him to just explode and make a very obvious over bet bluff jam, and you can snap it off with like second pair or something. But I digress. Pain thresholds and inflection points. These are important concepts overall, but they're, I think, most important in live games, or at least you're better able to figure out what the thresholds are and what the inflection points are. And when I'm talking about pain thresholds and inflection points, I mean there can sometimes be very distinct lines between a bet that is going to get called very often and not often enough, or not as often. For instance, if you're playing live and everybody's been raising in a 2-5 game to $25 to open a pot, well, if you open for $20, then that's going to be probably pretty similar to the $25 bet. But if you chop off $5 off that $20 bet and turn it to a $15 bet, you're going to get a lot of loose action, because players are used to getting this $25 open. When they see a $15 open, I mean, they're going to call wide, and often the big blind's just going to flick it in with almost any two cards if the small blind folds. Just feeling like it's such a discount, right? So there's nothing objectively true about that. That's not a rational thing, but it is a thing nonetheless, or can be. Or in a game where you've been playing, for 3 hours, and you've never seen a bet go in that was over, say, $60. Well, you might have a real threshold or inflection point at like exactly $100. Where that 90 to 110 range is going to be called way less often than like an $89 bet would be. So being on the lookout for those types of things can also help you. Again, especially maybe, I guess only when we're thinking about taking exploitative lines and using exploitative sizings. So here's some general ideas about bet sizing. In general, basic bet theory says the bigger you bet, the less calls you're going to get, and the stronger the range is that's going to continue against your bet, which seems to make sense, and that's absolutely true in theory, and it's usually true in practice. The bigger your bluffs, the more fold equity you'll tend to have, and this just goes right in line with basic bet theory. You're going to have more fold equity when you bet bigger, because more of your opponent's hands are going to fold, but the more folds you get, the stronger your opponent's range is going to be, because he's likely going to be folding the weaker hands and calling with the stronger hands. And the other thing is, when you're making a big bluff, you need a lot of folds in order for your bluff to be profitable. So the bigger your bluffs, the more fold equity you'll tend to have, but also the more fold equity you're going to need to break even on the bluff. And I'm trying to avoid actually going into the ratios and what bet sizes mean in terms of like obviously if you're betting 100 into 100 on the river, where you just either have all the equity or none of it and you feel like you're bluffing, in order for the bluff to break even, you're going to need it to work anything over, well, in order for it to break even, it'll need to work 50%. That's pretty obvious. And if you're betting half the pot, then you're laying yourself 2 to 1, so you can kind of figure out from there. But I think that's stuff I don't want to get into too much right now, but it's stuff that I think you could probably do yourself a big favor and work on that kind of thing, and make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of, like, if you are bluffing or if you're betting with a polarized range, how many bluff combos compared to value combos do you need to have in your range based on the bet sizing. And it all comes down to, if your opponent calls with a hand that beats all of your bluffs and loses to all your value hands, how often does he have to call in order, or how many hands do you have to put in your range that are value hands that are going to beat him compared to bluffs that he'll beat, and then what bet size do you need to use in order to get him to break even on his calls with his bluff catchers against your bluffs. And if you can get your head around that, then a lot of this stuff becomes more intuitive, because it flows naturally off of that concept. And lastly here, the bigger your value bets are, the more money you make when you get called, but the less often you're going to get called. And that should all seem pretty obvious, and I'm sure it is pretty obvious. But I think I think a lot of players could do themselves a big service by keeping these things in mind while they're actually playing. And it's one thing to know them and even to think they're completely obvious, but it is actually quite another thing to play as if you know these things and they're super obvious. So to keep them in mind. And all that means it's often correct to use large sizings when we have the strongest and weakest hands in our range, in our aggression range, or a polarized range. And it is often the case that small bets make more money from the aggressive parts of your range when you're betting a wide linear range. If you know what your opponent's range is like, you know he's got a lot of mediocre hands and some weak hands, then you maybe, and that would pretty much mean you'd have to have a range advantage to know that because we're talking relative, right? Relatively. So if you've got a range advantage, so whatever particular board that you're thinking about betting on, you just seem to have way more valuable hands in your range than your opponent does. So the board has really missed your opponent's range. It's given him a lot of air and some weaker made hands, like small pairs and stuff. But you've got more strong hands. You've got more frequent strength, and you've also maybe got more nutted value hands. If that's the case, then it often makes sense to just bet your entire range and use small sizings. The small sizings will fold out the air in your opponent's range almost as often as the big sizings will. And when you have the value part of your range, you're going to want to get called, but most of your opponent's hands are weaker, and he knows that you probably connect with the board pretty hard. So in order to get value from those hands, you want to bet those smaller also. And the opposite is true. If you check raise a flop of 8-9 deuce and get called, and you bomb the turn for the size of the pot when it bricks off, and you get called, and the river brings in the straight draw and puts an overcard out. It's the queen, and maybe even let's say you check raise the flop and get called. The turn opens up a flush draw, and you bomb the turn and get called, and then the river fills the straight, the open-ended straight draw that was on the flop, but it's also completing the flush draw that opened up on the turn. That might be a spot where you're going to have nothing but straights or better and bluffs in your range, and if that's going to be the case, the bluffs benefit from having maximum fold equity, because you want to be able to fold out things like two pair that your opponent might be thinking about bluff catching. And if you do happen to catch your opponent when he's got top two or a set or a small straight in some cases, when you do have the value part of your range, then you want to bet big in order to maximize the value. So when you're going to have a hand that's either going to beat everything in your opponent's range or be beat by everything in your opponent's range, betting big is usually the right idea, because we fold out more hands, and it doesn't really hurt us to leave in the strongest parts of our opponent's range, because the value part of our range is going to beat that anyway, and the bluff part of our range isn't going to beat anything he's got, so we may as well get him to fold it. So let's talk about river betting, because this is where betting is pretty simple, and if we can get our head around river bet sizing, then we can extrapolate on that, and again build up some more intuition. Now there are some examples that are not so intuitive, where intuition will probably let you down, and these following guidelines won't exactly hold. But we're not going to talk about those. Very generally, very often, most of the time, you can bet for value if you expect at least half, or anything greater than 1/2 of your opponent's calling range to lose to your value hand. So if you're trying to value bet, you need to have the best hand at least half the time in order to break it. Well, okay, for it to be a value bet, I should say. So if you're going to make a value bet on the river, and let's say, just to keep it as simple as possible, we're going to use the rest of our stack to value bet, then we have to know that if we get called, we're going to win the pot greater than 50% of the time. And if that's the case, then we're making a value bet. So you can bet for a value if at least one half or anything more than one half of the hands that will call when you bet are worse than the hand you're betting. That does not mean that you can value bet anytime that your hand is ahead of at least half of your opponent's range. It's not. It doesn't work that way. You've got to be, in order to make it a value bet and to make money by betting for value, you have to be betting what is the best hand, even when you get called, right? So you have to look at the range of hands that your opponent's actually going to pay you off with, and you've got to be ahead of more than half of those in order to make a value bet. Now, some of us, and I myself, I know I'm guilty of this, when we make a value bet on the river, especially in a live game, and get called, most of the time we damn well know that we've got the best hand. And if that's the case, where we're betting, praying for a call every time we bet, or else we're just checking back, then we aren't value betting thin enough. When you value bet in position on the river against a single opponent and get called, you should not be winning like 90% of the time. You should be value betting and running into a better hand some of the time. And a pretty, even if it's 45% of the time, it still was worth betting, right? So, you can talk about reducing variance by checking back and, not taking the thinnest value bets, and things like the chance for your opponent to re-raise and, blow you off of your your equity. Can reduce the number of combos you want to bet for value and make it so that you need to take thicker value bets and pass on the thinnest value bets. But when you're looking at like stack to pot ratio of 1 or less, like where you've got one pot size bet behind or even less than that, and your opponent checks to you, you should not only be betting when you're going to get called and know that you've got the best hand when you get called, you should be betting a little bit thinner than that. So the guiding principle is, in that very clean situation where there's no more cards coming and there's no more betting or raising that's possible, and you're in position and your opponent checks to you, if you're betting only when you're sure that your opponent will call you and be beat when he calls you, then you're losing value. And a river bluff needs to get folds equal to the pot odds you're laying yourself on the bluff. Not going to get into that too much. Again, you can read this, figure it out, do the math, get a piece of paper out, go to work, do some homework on this. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, but there are some pretty complex things that go into bet sizing, and this is probably what you need to get your head around in order to be really good in today's more modern poker game. That's game theory optimal, having balanced range, understanding the indifference principle, value betting, bluffing, and bluff catching the right percentages, and knowing how to size your bets to allow maximum value versus the entire range. So, versus the entire range you're betting against. Pot geometry. You really need to get your head around this and understand that pots grow kind of exponentially, and also understand that the last bet you make is very often worth more value to you than all the other bets that went in combined. So like if you get to the river and there's $150 in the pot and you bet $150 and your opponent calls and you win, compared to checking back and missing that $150, well, if there was $150 in the pot and you started this pot heads up, you only made $75 pre-flop, on the flop, and on the turn. But if you make this $150 bet and get called and are correct and you win the pot, then you won $150 just on that one bet. So understanding that, getting your head around that, knowing how pots grow, and understanding how that ought to influence our decision-making process throughout the hand is extremely important. And blocker effects. We should not be as inclined to bluff catch if we block hands in our opponent's bluff range, right? Like if we have the ace of diamonds on a board where it looks like our opponent could easily be repping a busted flush draw, Well, if he took a super aggressive line that he's unlikely to have taken with a non-nut flush draw, then he doesn't have a busted flush draw if we've got the ace of trump, right? So if that's the case, then we can't be bluff catching with hands that contain the ace of trump as often. And conversely, if you block your opponent's value hands and you don't block his bluffs, then you should be more inclined to bluff catch. And not going to get too into that either. In fact, it's something I feel like I need to work on myself, is really understanding combinatorics and blocker effects. But I just wanted to kind of bring this stuff up and talk about it and put it in your mind, plant a seed, hopefully get you thinking about what things you ought to be thinking about. Then there's some other considerations. Don't forget to factor in the times a bet's going to get raised. If there's, you're thinking that if you get called, you're going to be good just over half the time. That might not be good enough if your opponent has a stack behind that he can raise you with, and you're not going to be able to call, or it's going to put you in a lower EV situation than it otherwise would have been. Maybe you can still call, but you're like breaking even when he jams on you, or you're losing a little bit, but it's still plus EV compared to folding. Then that really can change the number of combos or the percent of your range or how strong your hand needs to be in order to go for a value bet. So don't forget to factor in the times the bet's going to get raised, the times it's going to stop villain from bluffing himself had you checked. Sometimes you bet for value in spots where your opponent's going to have himself like a bunch of busted draws, and they just fold, and you wasted a perfectly good shot to check and pick off what would likely have been a bluff. So you have to be careful about how you go about determining how strong your hand needs to be based on things other than just, will I have the best hand at least half the time when I'm called? If your bet is going to stop your opponent from bluffing, you've got to factor that in. And the times when you're making a bluff yourself, sometimes it appears to work, but you actually just folded out worse hands anyway. Factor those things in when you're kind of self-reflecting and reviewing your own sessions. There's times when getting called by better slightly more often than called by worse is still better than checking and facing a bet from a range that will cost you money to call against. This is not the norm, and it's super complicated, but it's something we should be aware of. And be aware of blocker effects. Understand how they can add or take away from the value of bluffs and value bets just by affecting your opponent's actual range. Be aware of elasticity. So many players get this wrong, and it's awesome when they do. But players ought to be continuing with less hands against bigger bets and with more hands against smaller bets. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. When you can make a big bet and it's going to look more like a bluff to your opponent, and a small bluff and that's going to look more like a value bet to your opponent, take advantage of those situations. So in conclusion, the things to consider: stack to pot ratio, or SPR. The range that you're targeting. If you're going for a value bet, there have to be second best hands in your opponent's range that you beat that can give you action for it to be a value bet. If you're bluffing, there's got to be hands in your opponent's range that can fold to a bet. So understand what you're targeting. Understand your opponent's propensities or proclivities. And understand ranges. Understand your opponent's ranges and your own ranges. And what's more, you need to understand how your opponent looks at or views or perceives your range. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather if you didn't figure that out. And understand what your bet's going to do to your opponent's range. How a range is going to contort based on how often you're betting and how big you're betting. And the pot size and the stack to pot ratio. Understand, think about, utilize the concepts of elasticity, blockers, and indifference. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment. If you're not pretty clear on the indifference principle and what it means, what it's about, your homework today or tonight is going to be to research and try to get your head around the indifference principle. Ask questions. I'd love to see questions in the comment section. So I think that's going to do it for now. Hopefully this at least got you thinking about some things. And if you feel like there's something that I didn't explain very well, maybe it's got you curious and you want to understand it better, just ask. Till next time, guys, good luck. That's quote Luck, end quote. Navinad over and out.